She stepped off the train with nothing but a stitched locket and a name not her own. Her groom took one look and said, "That ain't what I ordered." The crowd laughed. The law stayed silent. But then one man stepped forward. The sheriff. He took off his badge, threw it in the mud, and said, "I'll take her." Not out of pity, but because the rest of them just failed a test they didn't even know they were taking. Would you have stood with her, or looked away like the rest? The rain came down in slow, heavy sheets, turning the dirt around the station into a mess of slick brown paste. Smoke hissed as it curled from the chimney of the waiting room, where nobody dared take shelter. Instead, they formed a ring on the platform, tight, judgmental, unmoving. The townsfolk stared at the woman like she'd just stepped off the train carrying plague. Or sin. She stood alone beneath the iron awning, her small parcel clutched to her chest like a shield. Before we show you why a torn letter in the mud revealed more about a town than the woman it condemned, what one starless badge meant in the hands of a man who still believed in justice, and how silence can be louder than a gavel, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These aren't just stories, they're reckonings, carved in rain and remembered in quiet defiance. Your support helps us ride deeper into forgotten wrongs, give voice to the ones who weren't supposed to matter, and remind the law what a conscience sounds like. One click keeps the trail alive. Thank you for standing where others walked away. Her boots too thin for Wyoming, mud sank a little deeper with each second. Her dress, once ivory, now held the color of bruised clouds. But it was her face that drew the stares, not for what it revealed, but for what it didn't. Her name was Annika. She didn't flinch. Not when Eli Tranter threw her letter to the ground. Not when he spat the words, "That ain't what I ordered." The paper curled against the wet planks, the ink bleeding like a wound. Someone behind him chuckled, thin, sharp, nervous. A woman clutched her shawl tighter, whispered something to her neighbor. A boy no older than 8 stood slack-jawed near the telegraph post, eyes wide as coins. Eli stepped forward, lifting his hat so the rain could kiss his face. He looked her over again, slow, like a butcher sizing up meat. "Said in the letter you were 22, you ain't. Said you was educated, said you were proper." His lip curled like the word itself tasted foul. "You don't look proper, you look tired." Annika said nothing. Not because she didn't speak English, she did, but because speaking would have made her small. And today, of all days, she needed to be anything but. "I paid for something else," Eli barked, turning to the crowd now, seeking allies, nods, approval. "I paid for a woman who could start a household, not bring one down." A murmur rippled. Agreement. Discomfort. It was hard to tell the difference in weather like this. Silas Reeve stood at the edge of the platform, his coat dark with rain, his hands buried in his pockets. He'd watched the whole thing from under the wide brim of his hat, watched the way Annika didn't shrink, even as the circle around her tightened, watched the letter fall. Watched the way Eli puffed up like a rooster in a cage full of hens. He didn't much like roosters. Silas stepped forward, slow enough to be noticed, but not challenged. His boots clacked against the wood, a steady rhythm in the hush. All heads turned. Eli blinked, caught between defiance and confusion. "The hell are you doing, Sheriff?" he asked. Silas didn't answer. He reached up, fingers brushing the cold iron of his badge. The rain made it gleam like a coin flipped mid-air. Then, without ceremony, he unpinned it, dropped it. The tin star landed in the mud beside the letter. "I'll take her," he said. Gasps bloomed like firecrackers. Someone cursed under their breath. A woman muttered, "You're out of line, Silas." But the former sheriff wasn't looking at them. His eyes were on Annika. And for the first time since the train doors had opened, she blinked slow, confused, unsure if this was mercy or something crueler. Silas gave a half nod. Not to her, not to them, but to something higher, something that might have been justice. And then he held out his hand. The train groaned beneath her, wheels shrieking against the rusted track as it climbed the ridge into Wyoming territory. Inside the third passenger car, Annika sat pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass. She didn't wipe it away. She just watched the shape of the hills vanish into mist and dust. Her fingers, pale and stiff from the cold, traced the seams of a letter tucked inside her coat. The paper had been folded and unfolded so many times it was soft as cloth. The ink, faded in places, still bore his name, Eli Tranter. Beneath it, a promised marriage, land, respectability. A clean start. A man of stature and moral constitution. The lurch of the train jolted her forward. A baby cried somewhere behind her. A bottle rolled beneath the seat and clattered against her boot. She didn't move to pick it up. Across from her sat a couple whispering in German. Their child stared at Annika, wide-eyed. She turned back to the window. Her reflection stared back, cheekbones sharp from weeks of bad bread, eyes rimmed red from sleepless miles. She adjusted the locket at her neck, a stitched velvet oval bound in hand-threaded silver. Inside it, not a photo, but a pressed violet. Her cousin's, the only piece of home she'd carried west. 2 cars back, someone started playing a fiddle poorly. The rhythm clashed with the grinding iron of the rails. Annika closed her eyes and breathed through the nausea. The train was scheduled to arrive in the town of Stonecross by mid-afternoon tomorrow. She would step onto that platform with nothing but her name and that letter. The rest would be up to him. 30 miles west, under a sky bruised by late sun and gathering storm, Silas Reeve pressed a cloth to a horse's bleeding flank. The animal shivered, hooves shifting in the mud. Silas murmured low and steady, his voice more gravel than melody, but it held. The blood clotted slowly. Another hour and the mare might have died. She got tangled in Tranter's fence again, came a voice behind him. Silas didn't turn. Fence shouldn't be up this far east. He moved the line, the ranch hand added. Said the council won't care if nobody challenges it. Silas stood, slow. His shoulders cracked as he straightened. The blood smeared across his sleeves wasn't just the horse's. He'd ripped a palm on the wire pulling her free. He didn't look at the wound. He just stared at the ridgeline, where the tracks cut through the low hills and the whistle of a train could carry clear on dry days. "He send for someone?" he asked. The ranch hand blinked. "Tranter? He been bragging?" The man shrugged. Said he was expectin' a wife, mail order kind. Silas looked toward the east again. The wind shifted, carrying a hint of coal smoke and cold iron. Something churned in his chest, an old instinct, like the smell before lightning. He didn't say another word. He just turned, whistled for his horse, and rode off before the storm could settle. The train let out a long, aching whistle as it pulled into Stonecross. Steam billowed from its undercarriage, rolling out across the platform like a shroud. The rain hadn't yet started, but the clouds above were swollen, angry. The kind of sky that holds its breath before it breaks. Annika stepped down from the passenger car, her boots meeting the wood with the soft thud of worn soles. The moment she emerged, the sound changed. The idle murmur of townsfolk, those who had gathered under the guise of curiosity, lowered into something sharper, a hiss of breath. A muttered word, a question posed without needing an answer. "That her?" "She's not what he said." Annika adjusted the strap of her small satchel and kept walking. One step, then another. Her spine was straight, but her hands trembled slightly at her sides. She passed a woman holding a parasol without smiling. The woman didn't smile either, just narrowed her eyes and turned to whisper to the man beside her. Eli Tranter waited at the center of the platform like a man expecting a package, not a person. His arms were crossed, his boots polished, his shirt too clean for a man who claimed to work his own land. His jaw tightened the moment he saw her. He didn't take her hand. He didn't even nod, just stared. "You're Annika," he said at last, voice flat. "Yes," she answered. He looked her over, slow and deliberate. The parcel under her arm, the second-hand dress, the smudge of soot near her collarbone from the train engine. Her accent was subtle but unmistakable. "Not from here. Not from anywhere near here." "You're not what the letter said," Eli muttered. He said it like she'd forged herself. Behind him, the crowd swelled more now. Folks with aprons and coats, hats tipped back just enough to study her. They weren't curious. They were weighing, measuring. The town didn't need facts, just consensus. "She's not what he said," someone whispered again. Louder this time. A man with tobacco-stained fingers. Annika lifted her chin. "The letter was true," she said. "You just read it how you wanted." Eli's nostrils flared. He turned and made a gesture to the station master, something curt and dismissive. Then he looked back at her. "You'll stay at the inn tonight. I'll speak to Pastor Sims about this mistake." Mistake. The word hit harder than the stairs. From the far end of the platform, half obscured by the columns and the rising steam, Silas Reeve watched it unfold. He hadn't come to intervene. Not yet. He'd only wanted to see her for himself to answer the knot in his gut. But what he saw was more than rejection. It was performance. Eli wasn't embarrassed, he was signaling. To the town, to the people watching. This was how you dealt with outsiders, with pretenders, with those who thought they could cross distance and class on a promise and a piece of paper. Silas's jaw tightened. He turned without a word and walked away, boots echoing off the soaked boards. No one noticed. They were too busy watching the woman with the wrong face, the wrong voice, and no man beside her. The noose wasn't made of rope here. It was silence. And stares. And a name not spoken. The first drop hit as Eli held the paper high. A thin, dark circle spread across the corner of the envelope like blood soaking through linen. The wind shifted. The crowd turned their collars up. But no one left. No one even blinked. "She's not mine," Eli said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And this," he raised the letter again, the signed agreement, the pledge to marry. This was written under false pretenses. Annika stood still. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her. She didn't reach for the paper, didn't argue. She had learned a long time ago that truth spoken into a closed room echoed only off stone. Eli tore the letter in half. Then in quarters. Then again, until the pieces drifted from his fingers like ash. "Let this be known," he added, turning slightly to address the crowd. "There's no contract, no arrangement. She has no claim here." The rain started slow, as if testing their resolve. A few umbrellas opened, most simply endured it. They liked to watch, liked the righteousness of it, an outsider being put in her place. It reminded them the order still held, that there were rules, that people knew where they belonged. Annika blinked once. The drops collected along her lashes, darkened the collar of her dress. No one moved to shelter her, not even the station master. The platform began to clear, small groups peeling off with murmurs and satisfied glances. A few lingered, those always hungry for the final blow, the last humbling moment. A girl too young to understand clutched her father's hand and stared at Annika like she was something lost. Then, footsteps. Boots, slow, intentional, cutting through the noise like a drumbeat. Silas Reeve stepped out of the shadows near the freight shed, his hat low, rain carving paths down his coat. He walked past the station's edge, past the retreating townsfolk, straight toward Eli and the woman left alone in the storm. Eli folded his arms, his jaw twitching. "This is none of your concern, Sheriff." Silas didn't stop. When he stood between Annika and the crowd, he looked at no one but her, and then he spoke, not to her, not to them, but to the space between right and wrong that stretched across the planks like a drawn line. "I'm not speaking as sheriff." His hand moved slowly to his chest. He unpinned the star-shaped badge, dull now, with years of wear, and held it for a moment in his palm. Then he let it fall. The badge hit the mud beside the torn letter. "I'll take her," he said. Gasps rolled through the air. Someone swore. A man near the end of the platform scoffed and walked off, boots slapping wet wood. But Silas didn't move. "Not out of pity," he said, "but because every one of you just failed a test you didn't know you were taking." He looked at them now, at the faces that had judged, that had nodded along to Eli's condemnation. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Stonecross's problem was never its borders. It's what happens when someone crosses them, and you all choose comfort over conscience. Rain poured now, hard and steady. Annika still hadn't moved, but her eyes followed him like a tether. He held out his hand. This time, it wasn't a gesture of ownership. It was rescue. "And now would you have stood with her? Or looked away like the rest?" Comment below. The storm followed them home like a stubborn ghost, rattling window panes and clawing at the eaves of Silas's cabin. It sat on the edge of town, past the last fence line, where the wind ran unbroken across the prairie. Inside, the fire took its time catching. The wood was damp, and the old stove moaned as Silas fed it dry kindling with steady hands. Annika sat on the bench near the hearth, wrapped in a quilt she hadn't asked for. Her dress still clung to her in places, soaked through, but her eyes stayed fixed on the flames, not the man moving quietly behind her. Silas didn't speak at first, neither did she. When the fire finally cracked with a dry pop, he poured 2 mugs of coffee, black as pitch, and handed her one without meeting her gaze. She took it, nodding a thank you that passed between them like breath in cold air, visible but vanishing. "You didn't have to do that," she said at last. "Didn't do it for you," Silas replied. "Did it because Eli needed someone to tell him no." She stared at the steam curling from the mug. Her fingers trembled slightly against the ceramic, but she steadied them before he could see. "I wasn't the one he sent for," she said, quiet now. "Not really." Silas didn't react. "My cousin, Marta. She was the one who answered his letter. She died. Fever took her 3 weeks before the ticket arrived." He didn't interrupt. Annika's voice tightened. "I knew what the letter said. I knew what he expected. I could have sent it back, but there was nothing for me where I was. No name, no place, no safe nights. So I packed a bag and pinned Marta's brooch to my coat." Silas leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "That make me a liar?" she asked, half daring him. "No," he said after a long pause. "Makes you someone who knows when a door's closing." She blinked, uncertain. He sipped his coffee, then added, "I've seen men like Eli before. They write polite words with clean grammar, but they're just looking for someone they can own. A wife, a servant, a mirror. Doesn't much matter." She set her mug down, the clink against the table a little louder than it needed to be. "Then why put yourself in it? Why throw down your badge?" Silas studied her now, really studied her. "Because what he did wasn't about you. It was about showing off. He wanted everyone to see him reject you. He wanted the town to nod along." Annika tilted her head. "And they did." He didn't argue. Then he added, "You know who his father is?" She frowned. "No." "Mayor Tranter." She turned, slowly. "Eli's not just some ranch heir. He's the son of the man who hands me my orders, who pays half the council. If he gets embarrassed in public by you, by me, there's consequences." She drew the quilt tighter. "So this just got worse." Silas nodded once. "Storm's not out there anymore. It's coming from inside town." She looked toward the window. The rain had slowed, but the wind still howled. "What happens next?" she asked. Silas set his mug down, the fire's light catching the scar near his temple. That depends on how loud they want to be, and how quiet we're willing to stay. She didn't flinch. And that, he thought, was its own kind of answer. The sun rose slow the next morning, as if even it was reluctant to touch what had happened the night before. Stonecross awoke to a rumor already fully grown, galloping through the town like wildfire in dry grass. By midday, it wasn't just rumor, it was indictment. The sheriff had taken in a stranger, not as lawman, as man. A woman of unclear origin, whose papers didn't line up, whose name had changed hands, who carried no reference but a letter addressed to someone else. She was under his roof now, sleeping in the house where men once came for justice, not scandal. They called a meeting before the day's light began to fade. Not in the chapel or the town hall, but in the stable yard behind the council building, because nothing in Stonecross was ever as formal as it pretended. The town council sat in a line of mismatched chairs like they were sorting cattle, not deciding fates. Silas stood before them, coat buttoned high, face unreadable. "You stepped outside your role," said Councilman Everett, his voice thick with performative regret. "You acted as judge and jury. You brought shame on your office." "I gave her a roof," Silas said. "You gave her protection," another snapped. "And she's not your kin, not your wife, not a citizen under proper contract." "She's not a criminal either," Silas countered. "That's not for you to say anymore, is it?" Someone else muttered. Then came the real blow. Boots clean, government-issued, struck the ground behind them like a metronome of power. A man in a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat stepped forward. The silver star on his chest didn't glint, it absorbed light. The others fell silent before he even spoke. "Marshal Raylan Locke." The man introduced himself, voice smooth as worn stone. "United States jurisdiction. I've been dispatched following reports of civil disorder, misuse of authority, and harboring of fraudulent persons." Silas didn't blink. "That was fast." "We were already watching," the marshal replied. "Your town's been flagged since the rail expansion." He turned to the council. "We'll make an example. Send a message westward. No badges without oversight. No vigilante compassion dressed up as justice." Annika stood just beyond the barn wall, hidden from sight, but close enough to hear every word. She clenched her hands into fists to stop them from shaking. Every sentence was a slow dissection of who she was, who she wasn't, and how little that mattered in the end. Locke stepped closer to Silas. "You're done here, but I'll give you one chance. Walk away. Leave her behind. We bury the story, say you resign quietly." Silas didn't speak for a long moment. Then he stepped back, not in surrender but in strategy. "You want a trial," he said. "Fine, you'll get one." The marshal raised an eyebrow. "Under whose authority?" Silas pointed toward the town. "Under theirs." The council scoffed, some laughed. But Locke didn't. He looked harder. "I've still got witness logs, letters, testimonies. I've got every call I ever answered in this town. And I've got names, plenty of 'em, who remember what your precious Tranter boys done when no badge was looking." Locke's smile vanished. "I won't fight you with guns," Silas said. "But I'll bury you with truth." For the first time, the marshal didn't have a ready answer. Silas turned and walked out of the stable yard, not waiting to be dismissed. Inside the house, Annika was already packing. But he stopped her with a hand on the door. "Not running," he said. She looked up at him, surprised. "Then what?" He glanced back toward the town. "Testifying." The meeting was called for high noon, but the benches outside the old chapel filled by 10. Word had spread fast, faster than sermons, faster than justice. The sheriff who wasn't a sheriff, the woman who wasn't who she said she was, the marshal with a ledger full of warrants. Stonecross had never seen so much law and so much suspicion in one place. The townsfolk came stiff and silent, arms crossed and eyes sharp, ready to pass judgment without needing the facts. Eli Tranter stood near the chapel steps with his arms folded, jaw set like stone, his father the mayor looming behind him in a wool coat that reeked of smoke and pride. At their side stood Marshal Locke, arms at his back, waiting to crush a name beneath his jurisdiction. Silas stood alone, no badge on his chest, just calloused hands and a weather-worn coat. Annika was beside him, quiet, unreadable, her hair pinned back in a way that made her look older, like the years had doubled overnight. She carried no lawyer, no protector, no written defense. Just a small velvet locket, worn and fraying, strung around her neck. Councilman Everett cleared his throat. "Miss Annika, this town is owed an explanation. Who are you? What business did you have answering a letter not addressed to you? Speak now or accept judgment." She stepped forward. There was no tremble in her voice. "My name is Annika Voss. I took the place of my cousin, Marta Voss, after she died of yellow fever. I answered the letter because she couldn't, because I had nowhere else to go." Everett scoffed. "So we are to believe you impersonated another woman out of desperation?" Annika didn't blink. She reached for the locket and opened it. Inside was a faded photograph, edges curled, showing a girl with a sharp chin and wide eyes, Marta. Beneath the photo was a folded scrap of paper, thin and fragile with age. She unfolded it slowly, hands careful. "This is the bulletin from a church in Deseret. The day the food ran out during the famine of '62. My father's name is there." She turned the paper around. The man who handed out the last of the bread, who split one loaf 5 ways, was Silas Reeves' father. Silas looked at the paper, stunned. He didn't speak. Couldn't. Gasps rippled from the benches, the mayor's expression stiffened. Eli tried to scoff but failed to summon the sound. Then, from the third row, a thin voice cracked the silence. "I knew that girl." Heads turned. It was Maeva Quinn, the seamstress, thin, gray-haired, invisible most days. She stood up slowly, hands clasped. "I was at that church. I was 17. I remember that girl," she said, pointing to the photo. "She gave me the last apple she had. I never forgot her face." A murmur spread like smoke. Not judgment this time, remembrance. A thread of recognition passed from face to face. Some nodded, some just stared, but something shifted. The kindling of mercy catching light. The locket wasn't just a trinket. It was a record of grace, passed down through famine, sewn into hunger, handed from one hand to another until it ended up here, in this woman's palm. Marshal Locke stepped forward, voice suddenly quieter. "This doesn't change the law." Silas turned to him. "No, Marshal, but maybe it changes the people who write it." The mayor said nothing. Eli looked away. For once, the town listened. And for the first time in decades, Stonecross remembered what it meant to owe someone not in blood, but in kindness. The council called for a vote before the sun crossed its highest arc. No shouting, no gavel. Just a quiet raising of hands under the gaze of townsfolk who'd come for spectacle and found something far stranger: conscience. Councilman Everett went down the row, his voice taut with authority but lacking its usual weight. The names were called, one by one, and hands lifted slowly. Some looked to the mayor before they moved, others didn't. By the time he reached the end, the verdict was clear. The town would not press charges. Annika would not be removed. And Silas Reeve, though no longer sheriff, would not be condemned. It wasn't an acquittal. It was a reckoning. Everett cleared his throat and turned toward Silas. "The council recognizes that your actions, while outside the scope of your office, were guided by intent, if not precedent." He swallowed his pride as if it scraped going down. "In light of that, and by a majority vote, we offer to reinstate your badge, effective immediately." A pause settled over the crowd. Dust floated through the late light. Silas didn't move, didn't blink. He looked not at the council, but at the townspeople, at the faces that had watched Annika be shamed, At the boy who had stared at her like she was a ghost. At the woman who'd remembered the famine, and the names folded into the paper heart of a locket. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the badge. Still crusted in dried mud, the metal had dulled to a lifeless gray. He held it in his hand like it weighed more than iron. "I appreciate the gesture," he said, voice low but certain. "But I won't take it back." Gasps rippled, hushed but immediate. Everett looked stunned. The mayor's face pinched like a man tasting his own medicine. Silas continued, "I wore this badge because I believed it stood for something clean, something honest. But the day you all watched a woman be humiliated on that platform, and said nothing, that's the day I knew the badge didn't carry that meaning anymore." He turned the star over once, then laid it gently on the council's table. "I'd rather live by a code than enforce one I don't believe in." Silence followed him as he stepped down. But it wasn't cold. It wasn't contempt. It was something quieter, something new. The kind of stillness that comes after a storm, when you finally hear your own breath again. Annika waited near the hitching post. The same townspeople who'd once whispered now parted to let her pass. Some looked away. A few met her gaze. One nodded. Not approval, not apology, just recognition. She climbed into the saddle of a bay mare Silas had borrowed from an old friend. Silas mounted beside her, no ceremony, no farewell speech. Just a man and a woman, two stories braided by accident and choice, about to ride beyond the reach of small minds and big shadows. As they turned their horses west, Silas looked over his shoulder once. "You ever think you'll forgive them?" Annika asked quietly. He shook his head. "Don't need to. I just need to forget the parts that keep people from changing." And with that, they rode not away from justice, but toward a version they'd write themselves, under open sky, where law had less to do with stars pinned to shirts and more to do with the ones above their heads. The sky had softened since they left Stonecross. The land beyond the ridge was different, less orderly, more open, as if it, too, had grown tired of fences. Sagebrush rolled over the hills like low tides, and the wind carried no judgment, only distance. They made camp in a small hollow near a stream where the water ran clear and cold. That night, as the fire crackled and the horses slept with their heads low, Annika unfolded a sheet of paper and began to write. Her hand moved slow, deliberate. Not with hesitation but with care, the kind a person gives to words they wish they'd once heard. She wrote to a girl she did not know, one who might, at that very moment, be gripping a letter on a train eastbound, wondering if stepping off into the unknown would be a beginning or a mistake that would mark her forever. She wrote to the frightened and the shamed. To those who had been told they were unworthy until they started to believe it. Her voice, quiet and steady, echoed in the flickering dark. To the girl thinking of stepping off a train with nothing but a letter and a lie to keep her warm, this is for you. They will look at you like you don't belong. They will measure you by silence and by shadows and call it law. But you are more than a name they fail to pronounce. You are more than what they think they ordered. Walk off that train knowing who you are. Don't wait to be chosen. Don't shrink to fit a promise someone else made. You are not here to prove your worth. You are here to live it. The fire popped. Silas stirred slightly, his back to her, his hat tipped low. He didn't speak, but she knew he was listening. One man took off a badge to remind them that justice has nothing to do with uniform. That a person's value doesn't come stamped with approval, it comes from what they've survived, what they've given, what they've carried across unforgiving ground. And when you find yourself surrounded, misunderstood, or alone, remember, the noose they make from silence only holds if you let it tighten. Speak, step forward, or ride out. She paused, the ink drying. Then added one more line. You don't need their welcome to build your home. She folded the paper and placed it carefully into the pages of a worn journal. A quiet testimony. A seed left behind for someone else to find. Morning came with a thin veil of mist, and the sound of hoofbeats miles away echoes, or maybe others following a different kind of compass. Silas poured the coffee. Neither said much. They didn't need to. The fire had done its work. Behind them lay a town that still hadn't decided what it wanted to be. Ahead lay everything else. And you, what would you do if you had to choose between the law and what's right? The next story might ask even more of you.